Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual information session on the topic of access to COVID-19 vaccines, WTO collaborative initiatives, and analysis on supply chains and tariffs. Thank you for joining us during this very busy period for all of us. Before we start, I would like to touch on some organizational matters. As you might be aware, the resources of the WTO Secretariat are considerably stretched in the run-up to the 12th Ministerial Conference. At the same time, we want to brief you on our work in a timely and effective manner. Therefore, we are unfortunately not in a position to offer interpretation, and the working language of this session will be English. I thank you all for your understanding and flexibility. And I would also like to invite you to post your comments and questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will have an opportunity for questions, responses, and discussions after the presentations. The objective of this information session is to brief you, representatives of WTO members and observers, on the Secretariat's collaborative initiatives, as well as its analytical work on supply chains and tariffs undertaken to support equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. The Secretariat has prepared a new study on COVID-19 vaccines production and tariffs on vaccine inputs, and an update of the indicative list of trade-related bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures on critical products to combat the pandemic. These two information notes were published on the WTO's website last Friday and were sent to registered participants. There is also a new infographic based on these papers to which I would like to draw your attention. The respective lists have been posted on the Zoom chat. Since last year, the WTO Secretariat has been analyzing specific trade-related issues regarding the pandemic. The resulting information notes and other documents, such as notifications in relation to COVID-19, are easily accessible on the WTO website with a few clicks, as shown on the screen. I'm not sure that we're showing it right now, but you can go directly from the WTO homepage. Okay, so here it is. You can go directly to the WTO homepage and find the information there with one click. Furthermore, in the context of the trade monitoring exercise, the Secretariat regularly updates the non-exhaustive list of members and observers measures with a bearing on trade in goods and services, as well as intellectual property. These lists are also available on our website. When our Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, took office, she mentioned the third way, a different manner of doing things, moving away from the traditional business as usual to explore new ways of collaborating to find pragmatic solutions that are mutually supportive and effective. The pandemic has put unparalleled challenges before us, and we need to work cooperatively and with a true sense of urgency to find countries. The production network is not only becoming wider, but also increasingly complex and international. This is why we need to understand how trade tools can be used to strengthen value chains that sustain the production of vaccines and ensure a smooth and timely delivery to end users, particularly in developing and least developed countries. To open this information session, I would first like to brief you on our role in collaborative initiatives to enhance access to vaccines. Let me start with the Multilateral Leaders Task Force on COVID-19, led by the heads of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the World Trade Organization. The overall goal of the task force is to support delivery of COVID-19 tools to developing and least developed countries, and to mobilize relevant stakeholders and national leaders to remove critical fines and trade roadblocks. To achieve this objective, the task force is working closely with a wide range of stakeholders in the public and private sector. Led by the Director General, the WTO Secretariat has taken an active role in the task force, leading the analysis on trade-related bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures, as well as outreach to the private sector. The WTO has a unique standing to carry out this work, thanks to the recognized technical expertise of the Secretariat on these trade-related issues. We aim to produce substantive inputs to facilitate discussions and to assist decision-making by governments. Our overall project is to collaborate with the international community to reach the global vaccine coverage of 40% in each country by the end of 2021 and 60% by mid-2022. Our collaboration with the IMF, the World Bank, and WHO builds on interactions with the WHO's access to COVID-19 tools, the ACT Accelerator. ACT-A process is organized around different pillars on vaccines, one of them being COVAX, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Under the COVAX pillar, we have also participated in the COVAX Supply Chain and Manufacturing Task Force, with a particular focus on Work Stream 1, which examines the free flow of goods. I am delighted that Matthew Downham from the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovations has joined us today to give an update on this work and comment on our analysis. We've also been engaged in the ACT-A Facilitation Council Vaccine Manufacturing Work Group. The working group, led by co-chairs from Germany and South Africa, have published a work plan that considers actions to improve supply, increase manufacturing capacity, and sustainable capacity in LMICs. I am pleased to welcome Usman from WHO today to speak about this work plan and comment on the analysis. I trust that most of you know that the Secretariat also has well-established trilateral cooperation with the Secretariats of the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization, which began actually many years ago. The objective of this trilateral cooperation is to support an integrated approach to health, trade, and intellectual property. And on 15 June, the three Director Generals agreed to intensify their cooperation in support of access to medical technologies to address the COVID-19 pandemic and organize joint capacity building workshops. The first workshop took place on September 27 and focused on transfer of technology and licensing. A trilateral platform to coordinate technical assistance related to the pandemic will be launched shortly. An updated information note, including data to effectively respond to the pandemic, will be published in the coming days. There are, of course, also many other stakeholders with whom the WTO Secretariat closely collaborates, including vaccine manufacturers, input suppliers, and other key stakeholders from the private sector. Given the time constraints, I would like to refer you to the overview that was circulated in document RD/GC/15 in order to get a more complete picture. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the cross-divisional team working on trade and public health issues for making this possible and for their initiative and fantastic work on this topic. I would like to turn now to the presentations on the most recent analysis undertaken by the Secretariat. I would like to invite Roy Santana and Devin McDaniels to present the updated paper on trade-related bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures on critical products to combat COVID-19. Roy and Devin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, DDG, for giving me the floor. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of those who are joining us from all over the world. Just give me 1 second to put on the presentation. So this presentation is based on a revised version of the note on trade-related bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures that was released last Friday, 8 October, and is available in the WTO website. As you might have guessed from the cover of this presentation, critical goods for the COVID-19 pandemic, such as vaccines, can be delivered across the borders in 2 ways. 1, through a slow path that has many hurdles, or 2, through a much faster and efficient route. When maximizing the efficiency of a production chain, every little detail matters, and even seemingly small delays can add up to the end. Several half or 1-day delays here and there can easily add up to delays of weeks or even months. As it was already explained by DDG González in her introduction, Goods and inputs required to end the pandemic need to flow as fast as possible across the borders, in particular during a global scale-up of production to meet the world's demand. It is quite literally a world operation and a race against the clock. This underlines the importance of trade policy and international cooperation in fighting the pandemic, as any given measure introduced by one member can result in either a bottleneck that delays production or in a trade facilitating measure that actually helps to accelerate production. One point that I would like to stress before we continue is that this is critical not only when it comes to the final products, which in this example on screen is that vaccine that you see just leaving the factory and trying to run before it expires in 6 months. But it also matters for all the critical inputs, things like consumables, machinery, etc., which are needed to produce them. In terms of the methodology, the information was collected through numerous WTO activities where guest speakers have shared their knowledge, as well as feedback that was received directly from 10 vaccine manufacturers in the context of the Multilateral Leaders Task Force. Finally, we would also like to note that many of the measures listed in this document as bottlenecks derive from actions where governments exercise a legitimate control function. Thus, it is important to bear in mind that we are not arguing in any way that these legitimate controls have to be removed. We need products quickly, yes, but we also need them to be safe. Rather, the argument is that the speed of this business as usual has probably been too slow to respond to a pandemic, and that there may be more efficient and faster ways to exercise those controls in these situations. Let me be a bit more specific and show you a few examples. Like in any trade operation, the first delays can take place in the exporting country, where export controls and procedures play a critical role in ensuring that the goods leave as fast as possible. That is, if they are allowed to leave at all. One point that was made by the vaccine manufacturers is that export prohibitions have seriously affected production, and that it takes a lot of time for them to adjust the production chains to source inputs from somewhere else once these prohibitions are introduced. It has been particularly difficult for them to adjust when the prohibitions are administered in unpredictable patterns. Export licensing procedures, that's a separate measure, and this is a situation where exports are allowed, but then a special authorization is required, also seem to be delaying vaccine development and production, and in particular in three specific situations. The first one is when vaccine substance, which is packaged in bulk form, is then sent to a fill and finish site in another country. The second one is in case the company needs to send non-commercial samples to another country for quality control. Perhaps to explain this one a bit more, this means that the vaccine batch is ready to leave the factory, so production is finished, but then the batch will not be released for distribution until the company's laboratory in another country confirms that the quality of the batch is up to specifications. And while these vaccines wait, then the time is still running for the expiry. The third situation where export licensing procedures seem to be a problem is with respect to the movement of reagents and equipment used for clinical trials, which has slowed down the development of new vaccines, including for COVID-19 variants. Finally, the standard export and transit procedures can translate in some cases in some of these critical inputs getting stuck and delayed in these business as usual procedures. A solution that exists and has already been adopted by some members for other products is to prioritize the export of these products over the non-urgent transactions, which could be done through what in customs jargon we know as the green channels. Then the goods finally arrive to the importing country. It is well known that business as usual for import procedures can be quite slow in some countries, and in particular those that have not fully implemented the provisions of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. But there have been additional complications on top of the usual ones. One interesting example here are the working hours of the border agencies, which in some cases were affected because personnel was not really available or in lockdown. The vaccine manufacturers say that they would like to be able to import inputs around the clock on all days of the week, 24/7. which in some countries is already done for expedited shipments, but this is not done in all of them. So the two obvious measures in case members would like to accelerate imports include the full implementation of the TFA, and also, in addition, to explore certain TFA plus type of measures to further simplify and expedite these procedures, including, for example, the digitalization and the use of green channels, and some members have already done this. In addition, a constant public-private dialogue to identify and solve the problems would go a very long way in identifying what needs to be done in each of the countries. I would like to clarify that this has not really been a problem for the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, because these are typically newsworthy events, and you see television cameras and a lot of people coming to welcome them. However, this is not the case for the ancillary goods that are used to vaccinate. For example, syringes or cold chain equipment. You will not really see anybody posting a selfie with these products when they arrive to the country. But without them, it is not possible to conduct a vaccination campaign. It is also not the case of the critical inputs needed to produce the vaccines. Again, to give you one example, vaccines are produced in bioreactors that use plastic bags for a very large capacity of 200 liters or more. And if these bags arrive late from another country, or they do not arrive at all, then the production is either delayed or needs to stop. If customs officers don't know that these are important products, then they will be treated the same as any other ordinary plastic bag. A final point to note is that time is not the only dimension, and that there is also an issue of cost. Dayong and Adelina, my colleagues, will be explaining in a few minutes what tariffs are being applied on many of these inputs, which can add to the overall cost of vaccine manufacturing. However, it is worth noting that many members have already taken steps to either reduce, eliminate, waive, or in some cases defer tariffs and other taxes in other products that are needed to fight the pandemic, which is described in a recent report by the WTO Secretariat, which is listed in the slides. Thus, it follows that it might be possible to extend those unilateral reductions and elimination of tariffs and other taxes to the importation of vaccine inputs, which may go a long way in reducing the global cost of producing these necessary COVID vaccines. Thank you. This concludes my presentation, and I now give the floor to Devin.
Thank you, DDG González. Thank you, Roy. I hope you can see my screen now. So yes, thank you again. And I will now turn to look at some of the regulatory aspects. And I think in doing this work, one thing that we learned early on is that the regulatory dimension is really incredibly important and should not be overlooked. And this is one of the areas that was highlighted again and again by stakeholders, in particular vaccine manufacturers, as a major bottleneck delaying access to vaccines. The good news is that individual short-term action by members can actually go quite a long way in addressing some of these bottlenecks. So I will present a couple examples in the following slides, and we'll look at some of the bottlenecks and also some of the things that can be done to address them. Manufacturers have highlighted one challenge, which is arising from divergent filing, the data and technical requirements needed to register for an emergency use authorization of a vaccine, and also the need to reply to queries from regulators on these customized applications that need to be submitted in each different member. And this can in total incur delays of up to 2 to 4 weeks. Instead, it was suggested that members could rely on the WHO emergency use listing procedure or approval by another stringent regulatory authority as the basis for streamlining the filing and review process. Along these lines, the sharing of regulatory documentation between members is also helpful because it can help the member in question understand the scientific basis for the application. Another bottleneck is arising with respect to retesting of vaccines for quality control in the country of importation prior to their release. And this can incur delays of sometimes up to 2 weeks. Instead, these delays could be avoided if members could rely on the batch release from the producing country for these vaccines, which have already been extensively validated for safety and quality. There are another set of challenges arises in the area of post-approval changes and scaling up of production. So in the manufacturing of vaccines, as is the case with other pharmaceutical products, manufacturers will continuously need to be adjusting their production process, inputs, equipment, quality controls to both maintain and optimize production. And these changes happen after the approval or the authorization has been given. So one of the challenges that was identified by members is, by manufacturers, excuse me, is that there is sometimes a lack of accelerated processes for actually approving these post-approval changes. In addition, the timelines and requirements which need to be fulfilled in order to have these post-approval changes reviewed and accepted vary between members. And so this can create synchronization problems in the production process and can lead to delays of between a day to up to 2 months. As an alternative, members could instead enhance reliance on the decisions of other regulatory authorities as a way of facilitating this process. As well, the scientific advice that regulators provide to manufacturers in respect of these types of changes could be made publicly available so that the basis, again, could be better understood and the review process in different countries could be facilitated. Along the same lines, the introduction of new manufacturing sites in order to scale up production is also a source of potential bottlenecks. And manufacturers highlighted delays of up to 1 week in respect of necessary approvals and inspections that were needed to introduce new facilities in order to scale up production. It was suggested instead that regulators, that members could use flexibilities available to them to speed up this approval of new production sites. And also in this respect, the strengthening of regulatory capacity is very important, and because the capacity of regulators to actually carry out timely inspections and approvals is a key element here as well. Turning now to the donations aspect, there are also a number of issues that were identified in this respect. So of course, when we talk about donations, as Roy has said, the limited shelf life places immense importance on speeding up this donation process. You have this 6 to 9 month shelf life, as was previously mentioned, and if there are delays, say up to a month due to different regulatory bottlenecks along the way, this can have a big impact and risk actually wastage and expiry of the doses. So one big issue here is the need, is that some regulators are actually undertaking a full assessment and approval of donated vaccines, both in terms of the vaccines themselves and all the associated production facilities and supply chains. As an alternative, the approach could be it was suggested that members could instead waive requirements for this sort of high level of and very specific approval of each supply chain and facility in order to expedite the donation process. To avoid these types of delays that could add up to 2 weeks. Another issue that's coming more to the fore now is, as the availability of vaccines increases, a key threshold question as well is, are countries ready to actually administer the vaccines? And here there are numerous issues that arise from the need for cold chain integrity, the national vaccination strategy, the supply of ancillary materials, as Roy mentioned, like syringes, et cetera, and other things like adverse event tracking and monitoring, and also the liability and indemnity agreements that are needed. So getting all of these things in place and finishing the race on time is obviously a major feat and a major challenge that requires collaboration between all players. And this is really vital to avoid the worst case scenario, which is the expiry of doses and the wastage process. There are also a number of emerging issues that were identified in this work that could actually make the race even more complex than it is today to get COVID vaccines out. So For instance, one issue that was identified is that regulators are taking divergent approaches to the approval of boosters, and in terms of both the approval process and the regimens that may apply. And this also, it was suggested that this could also risk exacerbating some of the vaccine passport and travel issues that are currently identified today. There are also related to this, there are a number of questions around mix and match approaches. So that is when vaccines of two different types are combined, whether for the primary dose or also as a booster. And here there are questions also about the data that regulators need and the studies, as well as the liability regimes that may apply. Variant vaccines was also highlighted, and the need for additional guidance for regulators in terms of the development of variant vaccines. That is vaccines to cater to specific variants that may be developed in the future. This was also highlighted by manufacturers as an important question. And in addition, other issues like shortage of ancillary materials are extremely important. So whether we're talking about vials or syringes or vaccine vial monitors, these are very important, of course, not only for administering the vaccines, but also for delivery to developing members. And then related to this as well is, again, the cold storage capacity, which will be needed as growing volumes of COVID-19 vaccine are delivered to developing members, and more clarity is provided on those delivery timelines. So this wraps up our presentation. I think we'd just like to conclude by stressing that, again, what Roy said at the beginning, that this is not about eliminating legitimate controls that are really needed for health, safety, etc., but rather about being smart and finding ways of doing them more efficiently and expeditiously. It's all about people and making sure that everyone can get a vaccine quickly and safely. On this slide, you'll see a couple of the resources that are available, as well as the infographic that was recently released and was mentioned by DDG. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy and Devin, for that presentation. And let's now turn over to the presentation by Adelina Mendoza and Dayong Yu. They will give a short introduction on how the indicative list of critical COVID-19 vaccine inputs was compiled and how tariffs on inputs can affect production, as reflected in the new study on COVID-19 vaccines production and tariffs on vaccines inputs. Adelina and Dayong, please take the floor. Thank you.
To DDG González. Hello, everyone. In the past few months, global vaccine production has been scaling up rapidly. Over 7 billion doses have been produced so far, and a total 12 billion is projected for the end of this year. And by June next year, the production capacity could possibly expand to over 20 billion doses. Those vaccines will be produced in more than 60 factories in about 30 economies, plus many fill and finish facilities being set up in many other locations. Vaccine manufacturing is a complex process. It requires not only investment, technology, and know-how, but also hundreds of production inputs. No country can actually make everything required. Manufacturers have to rely on global supply chain and source inputs worldwide. New production sites may be even more dependent on foreign inputs. In other words, scale up vaccine production to some extent depends on international trade. Then facilitating vaccine production could be a trade policy question. As said in the previous presentation, measures are required to speed up custom procedures, remove bottlenecks, ensure timely delivery, and minimize trade costs. To those policy response, it is always important to precisely know these critical inputs and their tariff classification in the harmonized system. Early this year, the Secretariat team started a project to address this need. We worked with other international organizations, researchers, industry associations, and vaccine producers to identify those critical inputs required. We also worked with the World Customs Organization in funding appropriate HS codes. The result of this exercise is a joint indicative list of critical vaccine inputs published on 7th of July. The list consists of 83 products presented in 3 sections. In section 1, we try to capture inputs needed for making vaccines, including various ingredients, such as mRNA, viral vectors, lipids, and relevant chemicals. Consumable material, such as reagent, filters, bioreactor bags, and single-use assemblies. Production equipment, like bioreactor and mixers. Packaging materials, such as vials, stoppers, and seals. Many of those products have been in shortage of supply and have constrained vaccine production. Section 2 are storage units and tools for moving vaccine from factories to hospitals and clinics, such as medical fridges and freezers. They are critical for timely delivery and for reducing transportation waste. Section 3 includes medical supplies used to put in vaccine in arms, like needles and syringes. This list will be updated constantly based on new knowledge and needs. We welcome suggestions and comments from members. We hope that this list will assist governments and customs in facilitating vaccine production, delivery, and administration, and be helpful for manufacturers to identify potential suppliers and optimize their supply chain operations. It would also be helpful for policymakers to do analysis or stress test on those existing trade policies. Next, my colleague will present a tariff study based on this list. I give the floor to Adelina. Thank you.
Thank you, Dayong, and good day, everyone. I will continue the presentation focusing on tariffs and how this can affect market access of critical products for vaccine production. Some background technical information. We use the joint indicative list of HS 6-digit subheading codes for vaccine manufacturing. We excluded those for storage and distribution and also for administration. So only the codes on the vaccine manufacturing. We also focused our analysis on the 27 top manufacturing economies based on the July 2021 Airfinity report. That should be economies, not companies. The data we used on tariffs are those which we used, the same data set we used for the World Tariff Profiles 2021, which includes calculable ad valorem equivalents for non-ad valorem tariffs. The reference year is either 2020 or 2019. We matched the tariff data set with 2020 imports from the Trade Data Monitor. And statistics were calculated based on HS subheading tariff averages and HS subheading total imports. Some caveats on subheading data. We are aware that the products identified do not cover the whole subheading. However, identifying the actual national tariff line code, or what is commonly referred to as the 8-digit code, under which the specific product is classified across countries, is very tricky and tedious. The products sometimes do not even appear in the description, but rather falls under the residual catch-all category among the different national codes within the subheading designated as other. Nonetheless, we are quite confident with our statistics and tariffs as the following table shows. This profile is very similar to that published in the special topic of the World Tariff Profiles 2020, which was referenced in the article. The data set used here are only those subheadings used in vaccine manufacturing. You can see that 76% of the subheadings have one distinct rate. For more than half of the subheadings, there's no national tariff line breakdown. And for an additional 24%, even if there are breakdowns, the rate is uniform. Further, there's an 11% share in which the range of duties is very narrow, 5 percentage points or less, almost uniform rate. Thus, we have solid basis for average statistics for almost 90% of the subheadings included in the calculations. This was the graph used in the information note circulated last Friday. However, there are more updated figures in the next slide. Instead of 10 billion doses, the projection as of 6 October is around 13 billion doses by the end of the year. This is how we identified critical products and possible tariff bottlenecks or choke points among the 13 product groups used in vaccine production. In previous tariff negotiations, a tariff below 5% is considered a nuisance or inconsequential. Further, any tariff higher than 15% is called a tariff peak. These are the two levels we used in determining whether the duty could present a bottleneck or choke point. We associated the tariff level with the share of the product in total imported inputs of the manufacturing economy. The share of 10% is arbitrary. Using these levels, we came out with 4 critical levels. Any product group with average tariff less than 5% is not critical. So if the tariff range is 5 to 15% and the share of all imported vaccine inputs is less than 10%, we assigned the level of 1. And it follows that if the higher the share, 10% or more, we assigned a higher critical level. And finally, if the level of duty is greater than a tariff peak, greater than 15%, we assigned either level 3 or 4, depending on the share of imported inputs. And these are our statistics in terms of the weighted MFN and the number of possible choke point product groups. An often quoted statistic is that around 75% of world imports are on MFN basis, which is what we used in the calculation of average tariff. However, as more countries notify very granular imports data by duty regime for its national tariff line and partner, as part of the 2019 IDB decision, our updated estimate is that the proportion of world imports under MFN is closer to 80%. I would cite some examples. The latest IDB data on India's imports of sterile connectors in which the MFN is 15%, were from China, US, and the EU. These three MFN partners account for more than 2/3 of India's imports of this product. For the same product, Argentina, which levies a duty of 18% MFN, imports 50% from Mercosur neighbors. Okay, so that's preferential tariffs, but around 36% from China, EU, US, and the UK. For vials, in which the duty in China is 14%, it sources these vials 41% from the EU and 25% from Japan. So we think using MFN tariffs is still very valuable. Now, this is actually the same statistics, except that the averages are ranked from lowest to highest. You can see in here that the lowest tariff is actually levied in Switzerland, yet it has one choke point. United States and Japan have no choke points, and they have the next two lowest tariffs. The highest tariff among WTO members is in Cuba. And in Cuba, these tariffs are present a choke point in 12 out of the 13 different product groups. These are the number of manufacturing economies by choke point ranges. About half of the vaccine producers, actually 14 out of the 27, have 6 choke point product groups or less. So the US and Japan are these two economies which have none or all of the average tariff for the 13 product groups have tariff less than 5%. However, there are 6 manufacturing economies who have 11 or even all product groups which are choke points. These are the average and maximum MFN duty by product group for the top 27 vaccine manufacturing countries. The highest tariffs are on sterile connectors, sterile bottles, and bioreactor bags. So that's 6%, followed by 5.9% for sterile bottles and bioreactor bags. Vials and sterile bottles could be bottlenecks in 23 of the 27 vaccine-producing economies. So these 23 and sterile bottles, these are bottlenecks in 23 out of the 27 vaccine-producing economies. So with these statistics, it is obvious that the WTO member cooperation could support elimination or significant reduction of tariffs on these vaccine production inputs to reduce cost and expand output to meet acute global needs. There are additional slides in my presentation which refer to individual country profiles, which I attached for your info and reference, but I will not discuss them one by one. That ends my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adelina and Dayong, for your presentations. So as I mentioned earlier, the WTO is collaborating with the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force and the ACT-A Facilitation Council and Vaccine Manufacturing Workgroup. In this framework, I am pleased to invite Matthew Downham and Usman Mushtaq to brief us on their work and comment on the analysis undertaken by the WTO Secretariat. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Anabel, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to the meeting organisers for this opportunity to present and provide some intervention today. So what I'd like to firstly do is just give a brief introduction of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force and share with everybody the vision and objectives of this group that was founded, I think it was about May this year, April or May this year, between not just the COVAX partners, namely CEPI, WHO, Gavi, and UNICEF, but also the Gates Foundation and 3 trade associations, namely DCVMN, BIO, and IFPMA, literally across the road from you in Geneva from the WTO. And what the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force set out to do was strengthen COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing to secure more doses to mitigate the global pandemic. So we needed to try and support the mission of COVAX to end the acute phase of the pandemic by the end of 2021. That was the initial objective. We wanted to optimize the number of vaccine doses that are manufactured in a relatively short term and prioritize those doses for COVAX with special emphasis on the AMC 92 countries to ensure the greatest equitable availability of COVID vaccine possible. Given the escalation in vaccine manufacturing, typically per year, there's about 5 billion doses of vaccine manufactured and supplied globally. Through the COVID pandemic, that's rocketed to closer to 15 billion. And that has had an unintended impact on other vaccines and health products. And we've heard some of the critical supplies a moment ago from Adelina and from Dayong in terms of their criticality and their requirement for vaccine manufacturing, not just COVID. And then from a longer term perspective, the idea is to initiate regional health security through establishment of sustainable regional long-term manufacturing of vaccines. So the organization was set up to try and address these kind of core issues. And just to give you an illustration of what the team has been doing, we have quite recently established a marketplace for the trade of the critical consumables that we've already heard about: bioreactor bags, filters, single-use assemblies, raw materials, etc. Setting up a marketplace to trade those particular elements, those consumables, between manufacturers and suppliers, or from suppliers to manufacturers, to ensure vaccine manufacturing can be maximized to meet that COVID-19 pandemic requirement. Through the course of that, we hear about certain issues. So we have recently heard about the potential increase in single-use vials. So moving away from using multi-dose vials, maybe vials that house 10 or even 20 doses of COVID vaccine. Transitioning to single-dose vials creates issues in terms of glass supply. It creates issues in terms of logistics, in terms of storage, in terms of availability of doses, particularly in low middle income country settings. So to those AMC 92s, for example. So there's elements there that the task force raises those issues with manufacturers, with regulators, and with political leaders to try and mitigate that particular impact. And there's elements of areas that the manufacturing task force has worked on together with the WTO, as nicely described in Roy and Devin's paper on the bottlenecks. And I'm just going to kind of articulate a couple of areas in the remaining minutes that I have. The first, and Roy spoke on this a little earlier actually, is that expedited procedure and the requirement for it to support those critical supplies. So we heard about the single-use items. We know about the raw materials, growth media, growth supplements, for example. But there's also bioanalytical reagents, the antibodies, the antigens that are used for quality control testing. There's also the vaccine intermediates. So let's say, for example, drug substance or drug product is made, I don't know, in China. It is then shipped to the Netherlands for formulation and filling, and those vials then are distributed globally for supply where required. So you can see there's that mass global transport of materials. Vaccine manufacturers typically use hundreds to thousands of different component parts, and these are often made in remote countries and remote continents, let's say in the United States, but then they're leveraged and used in the EU or in China or India. So it's how to ship and expedite movement of those particular items. And it's quite surprising how just an innocuous piece of equipment can be missing and hold up vaccine manufacturing. The COVAX Manufacturing Task Force was engaged in getting crimps, basically clasps, to secure tubing to bioreactor bags. Without those clasps, the bioreactor bags are non-functional. And yet they're relatively simple bits of plastic, as it were, that clasp and hold the tubing and maintain integrity of that bag. By sourcing those clips alone, we resulted in being able to liberate about 14 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine. Devin spoke a little earlier regarding the regulatory elements, the regulators, the regulatory agencies. They are beginning now to look at the COVID situation and learn from the lessons that have been gathered into kind of two core areas. The first is with respect to the role in regulatory reviews that were implemented to support COVID-19 vaccine development and release for clinical trials and for market applications. And the other is the regulatory harmonization. And Devin spoke about this in terms of template documents, post-approval changes, etc. In fairness, all efforts should try and focus on mitigating country-specific differences in terms of regulatory frameworks, procedures, processing, and timelines. This is something the global flu community has been thinking about and talking about for quite some time. Lastly, there's the vaccine distribution. Admittedly, COVID has had limited problems or few challenges in terms of vaccine distribution, and that's articulated in Devin and Roy's paper. But what we need to do is learn from those lessons and try and have similar minimal challenges to vaccine distribution in future, noting, as was articulated, that vaccines have a critical shelf life, and border control warehouses are not necessarily the best places, most convenient places to store those vaccines. And any extended period of time in a border control warehouse eats into that expiry time, which can be weeks, can be months. Either way, it's time lost that then compounds the supply lines and the ultimate utilization of that vaccine in a clinical setting. So just to wrap up in the last 30 seconds, the manufacturing task force, the COVAX manufacturing task force, continues to engage with the WTO to support the free flow of goods activities, the trade facilitation measures, the trade facilitation agreements. There's key focus on the supply chain transparency, the customs procedures and tariffs. Great work that the WTO is doing in that respect to mitigate the impacts and challenges, the hurdles to supplying critical consumables and elements for vaccine manufacture, and then ultimately supporting the harmonized system that Adelina spoke about a short moment ago. So I'd like to thank once again everyone for the opportunity to speak today and compliment Roy and Devin for their publication, their documentation. And Anabel, back to you. And thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Matthew, very clear. Let me now turn it over to Usman, please.
Hi, thank you so much there, DDG. It's a pleasure to be invited to talk about these issues, and particularly in regards to the vaccine manufacturing working group. I will do as Matthew and provide a little bit of introduction of what this working group is and what they have been focusing on, and how this report is critical actually to the vaccine manufacturing working group's work. I'll just quickly share my screen here, and let's just see if technology doesn't fail us. Right. So very briefly, this working group was set up as a response to the creation of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force, as Matthew was talking about, and mainly as a ACT Accelerator Facilitation Council support to the work of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force. And it was really born out of the fact that the vaccine production and vaccine manufacturing capabilities were seen as unequally distributed, as also highlighted by colleagues in WTO, and how the political leadership in the ACT Facilitation Council could support the work of the COVAX task force and also try to address some of the political barriers and bottlenecks. So in the terms of objectives of the vaccine manufacturing working group, they have identified a number of things. Chiefly among them is to target some of the more short-term action that they can do in order to de-bottleneck the vaccine input supplies, so that can increase manufacturing. Secondly, is related to the more medium-term issues in terms of how to identify and also capture and use some of the underutilized and idle capacity. And thirdly, for some of the more health security purposes and long-term purposes, how to make sure that vaccine manufacturing capabilities are also transferred to low and middle income countries. I can share the terms of reference for this group later, but just to highlight who is in this working group. So as I mentioned, this is a working group of the ACT-A Facilitation Council, which supports the overall work of ACT-A pillars, including COVAX. And this working group is co-chaired by South Africa and Germany, Professor Roller and Mr. Dangor, and it has members from 9 other countries, and it's quite high level representation. And this group has, over the past, since June, met quite regularly, also with the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force leadership, in order to identify the areas and problem solve on how they can address these. Very briefly, both the work of the Vaccine Manufacturing Working Group and the task force, and actually WTO, have been reflected in the various declarations, including the G20 declaration in Rome and the G7 communique. And more importantly, in the G20 summit that was held in Rome, it was also asked for that the working group provides a report and an update to the G20 leaders meeting, and they're preparing that report right now. So very briefly, to talk about some of the areas that the working group has been focusing on, and this relates actually quite much to the outcomes of or the recommendations from the paper that WTO produced. And they also organize their work according to the work stream of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force. So focusing on the more immediate short-term action, the mid-term action, and the long-term action. The work plan will be shared with colleagues that are participating in this call, but to mention that most of the WTO related work is in the immediate kind of short-term bucket that they identified, and we're very grateful for actually the input from colleagues from WTO that has contributed to development of the work plan. So as Matthew was talking about, COVAX Manufacturing Task Force has had a number of initiatives, including the input supply marketplace. The working group members, what they have done is that they have amplified and advocated for that, and particularly in their national manufacturers amplified that work, and that has had an impact on increased participation in the input supply place. Secondly, in the work plan, the working group members identified that WTO proceedings are essential in order to address some of these supply gaps, and I'll come into a little bit more specific detail. But one key area that they focused on was how working group members in WTO, as WTO members, can also work towards amplifying the work that is necessary to ease import and export restriction, and particularly through facilitated agreements. And then on the midterm bucket, I won't spend too much time on this, but as Matthew was talking about, the postponement to single dose vials, which is essential to not choke up supply of manufacturing of vaccines. The working group members have worked with their national constituencies to promote this, and currently the signals that are coming is that shift is not imminent in high income countries. And then finally, in the long-term bucket, the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force have established an mRNA hub in South Africa, which the working group members, and particularly the South African co-chair, is supporting. So as I was mentioning, there are a number of apologies here. I think there is a little bit, you can't see the activities, but there are a number of activities that are directly related to WTO, and chief among them has been actually an ask from the working group to the WTO to articulate the supply of critical essential inputs and their choke points, and that paper has now been presented. And what the working group members have now been doing is they have been taking that feedback back to their regional groupings and try to advocate for that, and they will continue doing on this work throughout this year. Secondly, one key element that they have focused on, as I mentioned, is that supporting the development of these standard customs protocol for supplies and promoting that bilateral and multilateral agreements. They have written out to their respective WTO members and in Geneva and asked for providing support to the WTO forums that are working on these issues. And finally, they want to advocate with WTO to expedite longer-term system supplies issues, and that I think will have to pick up after the G20 report. And as you can see, there has been significant development in some of these areas, and while other areas would require more advocacy and more high-level political support. Finally, just to mention that the Vaccine Manufacturing Working Group is in the process of developing a report to the G20, where many of these recommendations will also be incorporated. That report is almost finalized and hopefully can be shared with the colleagues that are participating in the call in the next 1 to 2 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Usman, for your presentation and for your collaboration. Let me now turn it over to the session on Q&A. And we have received several questions for different speakers, so we're going to try to make the best of our time. If I can ask our panelists to please turn in their videos. The first question is for Roy and Devlin, and it's: how did the bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures change over time? Roy, Devlin, would any one of you like to take this question?
Yeah, perhaps I can answer that, and then we can say that for the moment, we do not really have that information. It has been a very major undertaking to gather all this information. Even as recently as 2-3 weeks ago, we were still meeting with some of the vaccine manufacturers who were providing information. So this should be taken as the status of the problems as of now. And then one of the important aspects that Devin was mentioning is that you can see in the outlook that there are some issues that might be coming. They are not problems yet, but then they expect they could become problems in the next few months.
All right, thank you very much. And while I have you on screen, we have another question that says: is it only about the movement of goods, or is the movement of people also important?
Thank you, DDG. Perhaps if I can take that one as well. This one is interesting. So today, of course, we focus mostly on the movement of the goods because it's the one that is easier to explain. But then I also wanted to mention that in this paper, we also identified quite a few issues where the movement of people is also critical. And this has to do sometimes with complicated visa entry requirements, limited flights, or even quarantine type of requirements when the people move around. And the question is why? Let me give you some examples. Vaccine manufacturing is a highly complicated endeavor. So you have very qualified people that need to move from one place to the other to help, for example, engineers that need to go and help to set up some machinery in another country if a new facility is being opened. But even if it's an existing facility, it might be that one of the machines is not functioning properly, it needs to be repaired. So you need to bring in the engineers from another country to do that. You may also have the people, the specialists who work in quality control. They need to go make sure that everything is working properly. And then finally, you also have the technology transfer aspect. which in most of the cases means you have the expert of the company that needs to go and train the local people who are going to be working in these factories. If these people cannot fly because they have no visa, if there are no flights to fly, or if they arrive to the country, but then they have to wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks in a hotel before they can start working, that in itself starts adding to the delays and the problems that you may have in producing the vaccines. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roy. We also have a question for Adelina and Dayong. And this question basically says, or actually we have a couple of questions, but one of them says, are tariffs generally lower for vaccines themselves or for the inputs needed to produce them?
Okay, actually, we did not really look at tariffs on vaccines themselves because we are not sure at the moment whether countries will waive the tariffs. What we looked at are really just on the inputs.
Thank you very much, Adelina. We have another question which says, now that we know that tariffs are still high in many countries for COVID-19 related goods, what would you suggest the next steps to alleviate the bottleneck?
I think that's a question that will be better addressed by DDG.
Thank you very much, Adelina. Well, I would say that what is important is for members to collaborate on how to reduce this tariffs. I think the document that the Secretariat prepared in terms of the indicative list of inputs on vaccines, and then this further work done by Adelina and Dayong provide evidence or identify where are the tariffs in terms of which products are facing high tariffs, and then this would of course provide the evidence and the data that is relevant for members to hold conversations as to how to go about this. Also, in the case of the work on bottlenecks, we also have identified a number of trade facilitating measures. And I will now like to turn it over to Roy and Devin to ask them whether they can share a couple of those trade facilitating measures that are critical for facilitating access to vaccines. Roy, Devin, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, DDG. I mean, number one on the list, I would say, is really on the regulatory side, is enhancing reliance between regulators. So regulators relying more on one another, and this is really based on all of the work and systems of the WHO. So, for instance, using the emergency use listing procedure as the basis for a national authorization. So that is really a primary thing and a fundamental thing that can be done as a trade facilitating measure.
Thank you very much, Devin. Let me ask Usman.
Perhaps, Anabel,
if
I can add two of the trade facilitating measures. Perhaps just to insist, this notion of the green channels is very important, because if you know which are the relevant products, which now we have a very good idea because of this joint indicative list, then it becomes easier for governments to really give priority to these specific products so they can actually move faster once they are going out of the country from the exporting country, and also when they are arriving into the importing country. And just very quickly to notice or mention that there are quite a few governments that have already waived, reduced, or completely eliminated tariffs on some of these products, but perhaps not all of them, right? And they have done this on a temporary, voluntary basis, but perhaps this is a discussion that is worth having in terms of what else could be done to do more in terms of a collective action. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roy. So Usman, we have a question here that basically says, are there some concrete steps that the Vaccine Manufacturing Task Force has been taking as a result of the report on trade-related bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures that are critical to COVID?
Thank you, DDG. I mean, it's a very relevant question because the working group actually asked also WTO to provide input on this, and then suddenly, this report came, which was very, very useful. And the conversations and the focus up until now have been that working group members themselves have been taking this back to their regional cooperation groupings and try to figure out how they can implement or ease some of the measures that can be eased, at the bilateral and at the regional level. One thing that I would like to say is that the working group members have actually requested or asked that in the WTO proceedings that there is a work or they would want to promote the work to development of model utilizing bilateral and multilateral agreements with the aligning guidelines to ease import and export of critical input supplies at all stages. So basically, what they have asked for is can these model agreements be drafted so countries can use them in for key input supplies and on key routes, and that will help the working group members in their bilateral and multilateral agreement to actually progress on these issues. And then I think this is a great challenge back to the working group on actually reporting progress on what they're doing based on the report that WTO presented. And we have seen some action, as you've seen. The U.S. and the European Commission have launched a joint task force on these issues, and they're reporting back on regular interaction on how they can, through these two entities, work to ease some of these trade barriers. However, you need a much more stronger response also in the other regions and also at the multilateral level in WTO. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Usman. And I have a final question similar to this one for you, Matthew, which is what resonates with COVAX Manufacturing Task Force mission in this note prepared by the WTO on bottlenecks and trade facilitating measures?
I think what resonates is the focus to try and leverage, for example, lessons learned from the COVID pandemic, but also minimize the hurdles. And Roy used that illustration a little earlier on one of his slides, hurdles and challenges to really expedite delivery of the core critical consumables required for vaccine manufacture and ultimately the vaccines once manufactured as well. That is the core aspect that resonates with the manufacturing task force. It's all about getting the vaccines to people as fast as possible, because as we know from WHO Director General Tedros, Dr. Tedros has said, we're not all protected till everybody's vaccinated, and there's still some way to go with that, which will require addressing the challenges, the hurdles, and the bottlenecks that have been so nicely described and discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks to everyone. This has been a very productive session. Thank you for the pertinent questions and insightful answers. And I look forward to to continuing our dialogue. And of course, for those of you who had more questions, the Secretariat and all those participating in today's event remain at your disposal. Before closing, I would like to welcome the WHO's approval of the first vaccine against malaria. Malaria remains a primary cause of childhood illnesses and death in sub-Saharan Africa and has impacted other regions too. WHO data suggests that more than 260,000 African children under the age of 5 die from malaria annually. So addressing bottlenecks in the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines can also help in the fight against malaria and many other diseases. With these, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. And again, should you have any further comments or questions, please send us an email at wtoevents@wto.org. Have a good day and thank you.